Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Get ready to stretch your mind today, because we're exploring a really big question. What if the most important questions aren't just about what something is, but maybe about how it really comes into being? And, what's truly underneath it all? It's the kind of question that can genuinely reorient your whole perspective on existence.
Indeed. And we're not just scratching the surface today, are we? We're really embarking on quite a profound philosophical journey. We're digging into contributions to philosophy of the event. And this is a text that, well, it fundamentally challenges our usual ways of thinking about existence, about history, even about the human condition itself.
Yeah, it's dense stuff, but incredibly illuminating once you start to unpack it. So our mission today is exactly that, to unpack the central themes, the core arguments of this work. We'll try to pull out the most important insights, clarify some of these complex concepts like being and the event, and hopefully connect them directly to your own understanding of knowledge and existence. Basically, we want to give you a solid handle on this challenging philosophy, maybe offer some surprising angles, some things to really chew on.
Absolutely. So prepare for a journey that might prompt you to reconsider, well, the very foundations of Western thought. We'll be looking at the nature of truth, the role humanity plays in history. It's big picture stuff, but we'll aim for a thoughtful, reflective tone, keep it clear, guide you through this intricate philosophical landscape without getting totally bogged down in jargon. The goal is for you to grasp not just what's being said, but maybe why it matters so deeply.
Okay, so let's dive in. And to begin this profound re-questioning of existence, we actually need to start with what looks like a tiny linguistic shift. Almost sounds pedantic, maybe, but it's this shift that seems to crack open everything we thought we knew about reality.
That's the perfect place to start.
Right. So we're kicking things off with this fascinating, maybe even slightly unsettling, move from being, B-E-I-N-G, to being, B-E-Y-N-G. It's not just a spelling quirk, is it? The text calls this an other beginning of thought, a whole reorientation. What was so problematic about how Western philosophy traditionally understood being that makes the shift to being feels so, well, urgent.
That's absolutely the crucial entry point. And it's where the author really starts to dismantle centuries of philosophical tradition. See, historically, Western metaphysics, and we're talking a long arc here, from Plato right through to someone like Nietzsche, has mostly approached being using what the text calls a guiding question. And that question fundamentally was always, what are beings? T2 on in the Greek.
Okay, so the focus was always on the things that exist, like this microphone, that chair, a person. What defines them, and not so much the underlying mystery of existence itself. Is that the idea?
Precisely. That line of inquiry inevitably led philosophers to interpret being as beingness, or ousia in Greek. Think of it as the stable essence of something, its constancy, its presence, or maybe the general categories of koinon that apply to groups of things. This approach, heavily influenced by logic and our human drive for reason, it kind of inadvertently pushed beings, the actual existing things, right into the foreground. And being itself, it became secondary, often treated just as an abstract framework or maybe an a priori condition for these things, like a container, rather than the dynamic energy inside.
So it became abstract, maybe a bit lifeless, like we defined the box but forgot what the box was actually holding, or even how it was holding it.
That's a good way to put it. The consequence of this whole historical trajectory was that being ended up becoming something abstract, general, even an object of calculation in some philosophies. It lost its original depth, its vibrancy. It kind of reduced the fundamental mystery of existence down to a set of definable properties, categories. And the text argues that this whole approach, while it was foundational for Western thought and incredibly productive in many ways, ultimately obscured what's most essential. It obscured the sheer dynamism of existence.
Right. And being then is presented as the antidote to this reduction. So what makes being with a Y so different, so unique that it needs this distinct spelling, this distinct term?
Well, being is fundamentally distinct because it's presented not as a concept or a thing, but as the essential occurrence of the event. That's a key phrase. It's not an object you can point to. It's not a general concept you can just define in a dictionary. And it's definitely not just the actuality or possibility of things existing. The text really emphasizes its inherent unrepresentability. It talks about it having the highest strangeness and an essential self-concealment. It's described as being more intimate, closer to us than any actual beings, yet it somehow remains elusive.
Okay, that's quite a shift. More intimate than anything else, but also fundamentally elusive and strange. So let me ask the question that comes up in the text. How does distinguishing between being as this sort of general concept and being as an essential occurrence, how does that change how we perceive the fundamental reality of things? It feels like it has huge implications.
Oh, enormous implications. If being is an essential occurrence, a dynamic happening, rather than a stable entity or concept, it forces us to radically reevaluate our usual tools for grasping reality. Things like fixed definitions, scientific models, they're incredibly powerful for understanding beings, right? How the universe works, how a cell functions, all that. But they might fundamentally miss the dynamic, self-concealing nature of being. They might even, the text suggests, entrench us further in a way of seeing that prioritizes stability, presence, calculability. And in doing so, they obscure the very essential occurrence that gives rise to everything in the first place.
So it suggests maybe the deepest truth isn't found in what is fixed and definable, but in the ceaseless unfolding of existence itself. Like reality is more of a verb than a noun.
That's a fantastic way to put it, yes. It challenges us to see the world as constantly happening, not just being. And it suggests we might need a different kind of knowledge. One that's not about capturing an object, but about being attuned to an unfolding mystery. A mystery that resists being pinned down. Hashtag 1.2. The event as the ground of being.
Okay, so if being is this essential occurrence, this deep dynamism, then the event, Ereignis in German, sounds like it's right at the heart of it all. The text calls the event the central concept, not just part of the title. Can you tell us more about its definition, its dynamic nature? It sounds huge.
It is huge. The event is absolutely the fulcrum of this entire philosophy. And you're right, it's not just an event, like a historical event, something specific that happens in time. It's the very self-unfolding of being itself. The text uses some incredibly powerful, almost poetic language here. It calls it the trembling of divinization, and also a conflictual appropriation that gathers all things into its abyss.
Wow, trembling of divinization. That sounds incredibly potent, but also deeply mysterious. Can we unpack that a bit? Is it like suggesting the universe itself is breathing or humming with some kind of primal energy that gives rise to everything, but stays just beyond our full grasp, like the deep rhythm of reality?
That's a really evocative way to think about it. Yes, imagine the event not as a single bang, but as this constant, vigorous pulsation at the core of existence. It's the primal energy through which being unfolds. It pulls all things into its orbit, gives them their-ness, their place. But it always retains an element of wildness, maybe. That conflictual appropriation part suggests it challenges any attempt to neatly contain it or define it away. It's described as a dynamic, self-developing edifice stemming from a turning back to the protruding ground. It's something that expands the temporal spatial playing field, constantly moving, constantly transforming.
So it's less about a singular moment and more about the ongoing fundamental process through which being makes itself manifest, or maybe sometimes withholds itself, which I think brings us to this fascinating idea of the intimacy of refusal. How does refusal fit into this dynamic unfolding?
Exactly, and this is where it gets even more counterintuitive, perhaps. Being as refusal isn't presented as just a withholding or an absence, like something simply missing. Instead, the text describes it as the intimacy of an allocation that actually clears the abyssal there. This refusal, this negativity, it's not seen as accidental or a flaw. It's said to inherently belong to the essential occurrence of being itself. It's through this very refusal, this dynamic self-concealment, that the open realm for existence, is actually made possible.
Okay, hold on. Refusal makes existence possible. That sounds paradoxical. We usually think of refusal or negativity as a lack, something negative in the bad sense. Can you give an analogy, maybe?
Right.
How can withholding something create space?
Think about silence in music. The rests, the pauses, aren't just empty space. They're crucial for giving the notes their meaning, their impact. The silence shapes the music. Or maybe think of an empty canvas. The emptiness isn't just a lack of paint. It's the very condition that allows the painting to appear. It's a potentiality. Similarly, the text suggests being's refusal isn't just absence, but an active clearing, an opening up of the space where things can come into presence, precisely because being itself doesn't fill that space like an object would. It's permeated with this negativity.
That helps. So this event, this dynamic unfolding that includes refusal, how does it contrast with our usual ways of understanding and categorizing the world? We love putting things in boxes.
Well, it fundamentally challenges that very impulse. The text is explicit. The event cannot be ordered, rearranged, or mixed up with categories. Why? Because categories apply only to beings, to the existing things we can classify. They don't apply to being itself, to the essential occurrence. So to truly engage with the event, the text argues, we have to move beyond purely conceptual determination. We need what it calls a non-conceptual reticence. It demands a different way of thinking, one that allows for the unrepresentable, that resists the urge to define and classify everything neatly.
Which brings us back to that reflective question. If being is an essential occurrence, not a stable thing, and the event is this dynamic, often self-withholding unfolding, what does this imply about our attempts to grasp ultimate reality using our usual tools of fixed definitions, scientific models? It sounds like it implies they're inherently limited, maybe even missing the point entirely sometimes.
It absolutely implies a radical reevaluation of those tools, and perhaps our intellectual habits more broadly. Fixed definitions, scientific models, they excel at understanding the mechanisms of beings. They're incredibly powerful for that. But they might fundamentally miss the dynamic, self-concealing, and ultimately unrepresentable nature of being. In fact, the text suggests they might even lock us into a way of seeing reality that prioritizes stability, presence, calculability, the very things that obscure the essential occurrence. It strongly suggests that a different kind of knowledge is needed, one that's less about capturing an object and more about attunement to an unfolding mystery, a dynamic reality that's always somehow both intimately close and strangely elusive. Like trying to understand the ocean just by analyzing buckets of water, maybe. You miss the currents, the tides, the sheer depth.
Right, you miss the ocean itself. Okay, so this need for a different kind of knowledge, this attunement to the unfolding mystery, it seems it's a direct result of how Western thought actually started its philosophical journey. So let's trace that path. The text calls it, rather critically, the first beginning, essentially, the history of Western metaphysics. How did it set us on this particular track? It sounds like that guiding question you mentioned, what are beings, really set the stage for, well, everything that followed for millennia.
It absolutely did. That guiding question profoundly shaped Western thought, and the text argues it established a trajectory that led directly to the plight we'll discuss later. By consistently asking, what are beings, it established beingness, udidya, as the primary, the most general determination of being, which meant the fundamental investigation was always directed towards the stable characteristics, the properties that things possess. What makes a chair? What makes a human? Rather than delving into the deeper, perhaps more unsettling mystery of existence itself, it kind of domesticated being, made it about classification.
And then Plato comes along. He interprets this beingness as idea, or eidos, the look of a thing. Now, for many of us today, an idea feels quite abstract. How did this move framing reality's core in terms of these unchanging ideas or looks? How did that fundamentally steer Western thought down this path? Maybe even unconsciously.
That's a really key insight in the text's critique. For Plato, the eidos, the idea, wasn't just an abstract concept in his head. It was the pure, shining look of a thing, its perfect, unchanging essence. Think of the perfect geometrical idea of a circle versus all the imperfect circles we actually draw or see. The idea provides the constancy, the true reality behind the messy appearances. This laid the bedrock because if reality's deepest truth is found in these unchanging, perfect forms, then the changeable, dynamic, sometimes messy world of our actual experience becomes secondary. It becomes a mere shadow of the real thing. And from there, it's a pretty short step, conceptually, to start looking for a supreme idea, a highest being that grounds all the others.
And didn't the practical world, like craftsmanship, also play a role here? The idea of form and matter.
Yes, absolutely. The influence of techno, which means know-how, skill, technology, like an artisan's craft, offered a kind of anticipatory grasp for interpreting beingness. It reinforced the idea of beingness as the junction of form, morphe, and matter, heil. The artisan takes formless matter and imposes a form on it to create a being. This distinction became another foundational framework for understanding beings, seeing them as composed of stuff shaped by a blueprint, essentially.
Okay, so we start by focusing on the whatness of things, that we get these unchanging ideas or forms reinforced by the form-matter distinction. And this first beginning then naturally moved towards to find a supreme being that explained all the other beings.
Exactly. The question of beings as such, what philosophers call ontology, almost inevitably led to theology. If you're constantly seeking the ultimate ground, the ultimate essence of all existing things, it's a very natural philosophical move to look towards a divine origin or a highest being, an ens entium, as the ultimate ground or first cause. So this theological dimension became deeply interwoven with metaphysical inquiry throughout much of Western history.
And then later on, particularly starting with Descartes, it seems like the focus shifted inwards, towards the humor mind, consciousness. And that changed what beingness even meant.
That's right. That's another crucial turn within this first beginning. With Descartes and his famous ego cogito, I think therefore I am, philosophy increasingly retreated into consciousness, into subjectivity. This paved the way for various forms of idealism, where beingness fundamentally became representedness. The reality of things was understood primarily through how they were represented in the mind. Reality became something grasped by a subject. And the text argues that this ultimately, ironically, disempowered being itself. It made being secondary to an empowerment of beings, but specifically beings as objects of human thought, human will, human representation. The human mind became the measure of all things, in a way.
Which brings us up to Nietzsche. He's often seen as challenging these traditions, inverting Plato, right? But the text suggests even he, in a way, remained trapped within this first beginnings framework. It says he brought a creative end to metaphysics, but not a complete break. How so?
Well, Nietzsche, with powerful concepts like the will to power and the eternal recurrence, definitely brought a creative end to metaphysics. He radically challenged Platonism, emphasizing becoming, life, the body, over static transcendent ideals. He celebrated the earthly, the dynamic. However, the text suggests he still operated within the fundamental framework established by the first beginning. His focus on life, for example, as a means of securing continuance or asserting power, is still seen as a preoccupation with the beings and their persistence, their self-assertion. It wasn't quite the leap into questioning being itself and its essential occurrence. His challenge was profound, absolutely, but it was perhaps more like a radical renovation within the metaphysical house rather than questioning the foundations the house was built on.
Okay, that makes sense. And throughout this entire vast sweep of the first beginning from Plato to Nietzsche, how was truth understood? My sense is it was largely about accuracy, about correspondence, getting things right.
Yes, overwhelmingly, truth was understood primarily as correctness. The Greek homoiosis, the Latin adequatio, it meant a correspondence, an agreement between a statement or a representation in the mind and the actual thing out there in the world. A statement was true if it accurately reflected the state of affairs. And while that's obviously important, the text argues it limited truth primarily to the observable, the verifiable, the calculable. In doing so, it inevitably obscured a deeper, more originative sense of truth not just as correctness, but as a kind of fundamental opening, a clearing within which things can appear at all, including their concealment. Truth became purely a property of propositions rather than a fundamental event of existence.
So let's bring this home for the listener. If Western thought for millennia has historically focused on beings, things, and on truth as correctness, how might this have shaped, well, everything, our institutions, our sciences, even just our everyday quest for knowledge? It seems like it would create a very particular kind of worldview, maybe even blind spots.
Oh, the impact has been absolutely enormous, pervasive. Think about our institutions. Legal systems demanding verifiable evidence, educational systems prioritizing measurable learning outcomes, economic models based on quantifiable value and growth. They often prioritize verifiable facts, logical consistency, utility, all hallmarks of that focus on beings and truth as correctness. Our sciences excel brilliantly at analyzing beings, breaking them down, understanding their mechanisms, making them predictable, usable. That's a direct outcome of this tradition. And even our everyday quest for knowledge often boils down to gathering facts, proving points, seeking objective certainty. We want the right answer.
But isn't that a bit bleak? I mean, that scientific and technological progress based on understanding beings and correctness has undeniably improved countless lives. Is the text suggesting we should just abandon these incredibly successful approaches, or is it more nuanced?
That's a really important question. No, the text isn't arguing for abandonment. It's more about recognizing the limitations of this approach and perhaps the need for a fundamental reprioritization, or at least a broadening of perspective. The argument is that when calculability, usefulness, and correctness become the only or the dominant lenses through which we view reality, we inadvertently obscure other, perhaps more fundamental dimensions of existence. We become incredibly skilled at mastering the what and the how-to regarding beings, but we might lose our attunement to the deeper why or the sheer thatness of being's essential occurrence. The danger, as the text sees it, isn't that this approach is wrong, but that its very success might blind us to aspects of reality that aren't easily representable, calculable, or stable. It might make us less sensitive to the essential occurrence, the unrepresentable, the mystery. And this, the text suggests, leads to a condition it calls the abandonment by being. Hashtag 2.2, the necessity of the other beginning and inceptual thinking.
Right, the abandonment by being. This brings us to the stark realization the text puts forward. that this whole trajectory, this entire first beginning of Western metaphysics, despite all its achievements, ultimately leads to a profound kind of plight. So what makes this other beginning so necessary, and what exactly is this plight? It sounds quite serious.
It's presented as extremely serious. The other beginning becomes necessary, the text argues, precisely because the first beginning has culminated in this plight of the abandonment by being. And this isn't just an abstract philosophical problem for academics, it's framed as a deep historical condition, an existential crisis for humanity. What does abandonment by being mean? It means that being, in its essential occurrence, is effectively withdrawing, abandoning beings, leaving them to themselves. And the consequence is that beings are increasingly allowed to become mere objects of machination, a term we definitely need to unpack soon. This abandonment leaves humanity feeling adrift, maybe, without a genuine grounding in the essential flow of existence, leading to a sense of lostness, superficiality, maybe even meaninglessness in the modern world.
So being withdraws its essential presence, or maybe its essential happening, and things, beings, are just sort of left over, becoming mere tools, calculable entities, in a world that feels increasingly hollow or flat. And to address this, we need a whole new way of thinking. The text calls it inceptual thinking. What does that mean? To think inceptually.
Inceptual thinking is described as originary and inventive. It's crucial that it's not about just continuing the old path or refining existing metaphysical concepts. That won't work, the text implies. Instead, it means thinking out of the beginning again. But not just repeating the start, it's described as a more original repetition of the first beginning. It involves a profound, almost revolutionary return to the very origins of thought, but asking different, more fundamental questions. It's framed as a leap. The German has sprung a leap into the domain of the history of being, a venture into the unweighable that goes beyond just logical reasoning or historical record-keeping. It's about trying to remember or maybe reignite something that was forgotten or missed right at the very start of philosophy.
And what's the goal of this demanding kind of thinking? It sounds like it's aiming for something much bigger than just academic understanding. It feels almost restorative, or maybe even preventative.
Its purpose is framed as deeply existential and historical. It encompasses really nothing less than the future course of humanity. The text says it aims to save us from lostness in the bustle of mere incidents and machinations, and to bring us to ourselves and face to face with work and sacrifice. So, it seeks to reground humanity in the truth of being, to move beyond the superficiality and the instrumentalization of everything that characterizes the modern age as the text sees it. And this thinking isn't just making things up, it's described as a standing up to being and challenging being to attune the questioning through and through, reshaping the very questions we ask about reality.
So this leap, this transition to intellectual thinking, it isn't about saying metaphysics was wrong or pointing out logical errors. It's something deeper than critique.
Exactly. It's not about refutation in the usual sense. It's about a fundamental realization. It's about recognizing that metaphysics' way of interpreting beings, while historically dominant, has lost all necessity. It no longer provides a genuine grounding in an age marked by the withdrawal of being. It must be surpassed, overcome. So this isn't just a philosophical preference, it's presented as an urgent historical necessity, a call to forge a new historical path, one where the truth of being becomes central again, not just for philosophers, but as a grounding for future history itself. It requires, as the text puts it, both courage for the old, respecting the past, and freedom for the new, a radical openness to what might come.
Okay, this is profound. If traditional philosophy, the first beginning, despite all its undeniable achievements, ultimately led us to this abandonment by being, this plight, what new kinds of insights, what new understandings might we actually gain if we fundamentally re-question our whole approach to existence? It feels like it suggests there's a vast, untapped potential for understanding that our current frameworks might be actively blocking.
The potential insights are framed as nothing short of transformative. By shifting from the guiding question, what are beings, to the more fundamental basic question, what is the truth of being? We potentially open ourselves to understanding reality in a way that isn't constrained by objectification, calculation, or representation. We might begin to grasp existence not just as a collection of stable things, but as this essential occurrence, this dynamic event that is simultaneously intimate and strangely concealed. This could perhaps lead to a renewed sense of wonder, a deeper attunement to the sheer mystery of existence, a recognition of the profound interconnectedness of all things within the flow of being's history. It's really about seeing the entire universe and our place within it with fundamentally fresh eyes. Like, as you said before, stepping out of a familiar room into the vastness of a starlit night. It could reveal truth not just as correctness, but as this dynamic clearing for self-concealing, a much richer, deeper, maybe even more unsettling concept of truth.
A truth that includes darkness, not just light.
Precisely, a truth that acknowledges the mystery.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, but it's deeply connected. Let's talk about humanity's place within this new philosophical landscape, specifically this crucial concept of Seyn. The text really hammers this point. Seyn is not the human subject or the ego as we typically understand it. It's not just Descartes' I think, therefore I am. So, if it's not our everyday sense of self, what is Seyn in this philosophy? It sounds radically different.
It is a truly crucial redefinition, and it really pulls the rug out from under centuries of human-centered, anthropocentric thought. Seyn, in this context, is fundamentally not the individual human subject. It's not the ego cogito. It's not just a biological organism or even a psychological self. It aims to transcend all those conventional notions of subjectivity and anthropology. Instead, Seyn is presented as the grounding ground. It's the between and the middle of beings themselves.
Whoa, okay. So it's less about who I am as an individual, my personal thoughts, feelings, biography, and more about the space or the clearing that we, as humans, somehow provide. A space for being to unfold. That sounds less like a definition of humanity and more like a task or a transformation for humanity. Is that right?
That's exactly it. The text describes Seyn as the self-opening center of the counterplay between call and belonging. It's the very site, the there, that's the da in Seyn, where the truth of being can potentially be grounded and preserved. And yes, this implies a radical transformation of what it means to be human. The human being, in what the text calls a future, only futural essence, is transformed into the steward of the indigence of the gods, which means moving beyond the traditional definition of human as the animal rationale, the rational animal, and becoming instead the preserver of the truth of being. So it's not about improving anthropology, making a better science of humans. It's about radically regrounding the human self from the truth of being. Our essence becomes intertwined with this larger philosophical historical project. Our role, essentially, is to be strong and knowledgeable enough to receive being's thrust and gather its empowerment.
And this idea of thrownness, that humans are thrust ahead into there, it implies we don't just choose this role. We're sort of placed into it. It's not accidental, but an essential belonging.
Yes, exactly. Humans are thrust ahead into this is experienced as thrownness. And this means, the text argues, that humans are appropriated by being itself. This isn't seen as an accident of birth or a random event. It's a profound belonging, an essential consignment to being. We are, in a deep sense, claimed by being to fulfill this stewardship, to be the guardians, the clearers, the preservers of its truth. And this act of self-casting loose from our prior, perhaps more comfortable understandings of ourselves is seen as the very beginning of authentic Seyn. We are, quite literally, their day for being Seyn.
Okay, let's reflect on this for a moment, maybe bring it closer to the listener. How might understanding our individual existence, our Seyn, as a grounding of truth, rather than just a subjective experience or a biological function, how might that alter our sense of purpose, our sense of responsibility? It feels like it massively elevates our role, giving it a cosmic significance or at least a deeply existential weight beyond just survival or personal happiness.
It fundamentally reorients our purpose, absolutely. It gives it an incredible, maybe even intimidating weight. If Seyn is the grounding of truth, then our existence isn't merely about our personal feelings, our perceptions, our biological needs, or even our individual achievements. It confers a profound responsibility to be the clearing, the site, the there, where the truth of being can unfold and be sheltered. This shifts our focus. It moves away from purely introspective self-analysis or purely external scientific observation towards a deep, receptive attunement to being's essential occurrence. Our actions, our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking suddenly gain a new historical significance. They become integral to the larger drama of being's truth playing out in history. It implies that our individual choices, our ways of being, are not just personal matters. They reverberate within the very historicality of existence. They impact whether being remains concealed and forgotten or whether it finds its appropriate sheltering and grounding through us. It means, in a profound way, your existence isn't just about you. It's about the ongoing unfolding or perhaps the withdrawal of reality itself.
That's a heavy, but also potentially inspiring way to think about being human.
It is. It demands a lot. Hashtag 3.2. The basic disposition and restraint.
So if Seyn is this profound grounding of truth, this being there for being, this stewardship, how do we actually cultivate that? How do we live up to that responsibility? The text introduces some key ideas here: basic disposition and restraint. What exactly is a basic disposition in this deep context? It doesn't sound like just being in a good mood.
No, definitely not just a mood. All essential thinking, the text argues, demands that its thoughts be newly extracted each time out of the basic disposition. And this disposition is not seen as something weak or erratic, like shifting emotions. On the contrary, it's described as the diffusion of the trembling of being as a vent in Dasein. So it's a profound state of attunement, a deep, sustained inner orientation that allows us to genuinely encounter or be encountered by being.
Okay, so it's not just a fleeting feeling, but a deep, fundamental resonance within us, a sustained inner state that lets us feel the very pulse of ultimate reality, perhaps. Like our internal compass isn't just pointing north, but is somehow tuned into the source of all this happening.
Precisely. It's an inner attunement, a profound steadfastness. It allows us to truly listen to the unrepresentable, the elusive, instead of being deafened by the constant noise of everyday concepts, calculations, and chatter. Without this basic disposition, the text warns, thinking just becomes a forced clatter of concepts and of the mere shells of words. It lacks true depth, true connection to the source.
And what are the specific flavors, maybe? What are the key dispositions that make up this fundamental attunement?
The text names several specific ones, and they're quite striking. Shock, restraint, diffidence, presentiment, foreboding. These aren't presented as just emotions in the usual sense, but as fundamental modes of being that prepare Dasein for the appropriation by being. They indicate a kind of radical openness, maybe a humility, a willingness to step into the unknown, to be genuinely affected by the profound mystery and strangeness of existence.
Restraint seems particularly important here. You mentioned it as one of the key dispositions. How is it described? Because it sounds like it's much more than just holding back or being passive.
Restraint, for Holt and Haidt, is absolutely crucial. It's described as a strongest and at the same time most delicate preparedness of Dasein for the appropriation. It prepares us for being thrown into a genuine standing within the truth of the turning in the event. So, it's not passive waiting, it's an active, watchful stillness, a profound inner quietude. The text says it creates the great stillness, which is necessary for the dominion of the last God to even make itself felt, to intimate itself. It's seen as a fundamental trait of the basic disposition, disposing us toward fathoming the abyssal ground of Dasein and the essential event itself.
And connected to this is the idea of renunciation. But again, the text seems to twist the usual meaning. It's not about giving something up and feeling deprived.
That's right. Preparedness for the refusal, that essential negativity or self-withholding of being we discussed earlier, consists in renunciation. But this isn't presented as ascetic self-denial or a lack of desire in the usual sense. Instead, it's framed quite paradoxically as the highest form of possession. It's possession of the inconceivable donation of the refusal. It means actively embracing the self-concealing aspect of being, finding richness and depth in its very withholding, rather than constantly trying to force it into presence, into calculability, into graspable concepts. This decisive stance, this renunciation sustained by restraint, is what grounds the abyssal in-between, that transition point from the old metaphysical beginning to the needed other beginning. It's an act of profound intellectual humility and patience.
Okay, this is challenging. In a world like ours, which so often values immediate action, clear results, constant productivity, quantifiable outcomes, what does it mean practically to try and cultivate a basic disposition of restraint and diffidence when approaching these profound questions? It feels almost entirely countercultural, doesn't it?
It is entirely countercultural to the prevailing norms, absolutely. Cultivating restraint and diffidence means actively resisting the powerful urge for quick answers, for immediate utility, for definitive conclusions, especially when dealing with fundamental questions of existence. It's about developing a profound patience, an openness to ambiguity, maybe even an acceptance of the unanswerable. In a world saturated with instant information demanding constant output, this kind of disposition requires a conscious willingness to slow down. To listen, really listen to the trembling of being, as the text puts it. To allow questions to resonate deeply without rushing to closure. It means valuing the process of thoughtful questioning itself and the deep, often silent attunement to existence, perhaps more than the clamor for tangible results and visible achievements. It's not easy. My own brain often fights against it, wanting the clear answer now, but the text suggests this difficult path could open us up to possibilities, to truths that are otherwise completely obscured by our relentless pursuit of the immediately graspable and the immediately useful.
A willingness to dwell on the question, maybe.
Exactly, to let the question work on you.
So this brings us directly to the text's diagnosis of the plight of the modern age. And it introduces some really powerful, critical concepts here. Machination, and lived experience.
You mentioned earlier that this abandonment by being is strongest where it's most hidden, in the everyday. Can you elaborate on that? How does this abandonment manifest subtly?
Yes, the text argues that the abandonment by being is most powerfully, most insidiously hidden, precisely where beings have become the most ordinary and most usual. What does this mean? It means being, in its essential occurring, withdraws its presence from beings, leaving them just there as things. And in doing so, it allows them to become mere objects of machination. It's not usually a dramatic, noticeable event like the sky falling. It's a pervasive condition where the essential happening of existence, the sheer wonder of being, is overlooked precisely because everything is simply taken for granted. Everything is available, manipulable, ordinary. We don't notice the absence of being because we're so utterly preoccupied with the presence and management of beings. Okay, so let's unpack machination. You stressed earlier it's not about human scheming or some kind of conspiracy. It's something deeper, more fundamental. A mode of reality itself in our age.
That's the critical distinction, yes. Machination, Machenschaft, doesn't mean human plotting or some bad kind of technology that we could simply choose to stop using. Instead, the text uses it to name a mode of the essential occurrence of being itself, a fundamental way in which reality unfolds and presents itself in this particular historical epoch. It's described as the sovereignty of making and of the realm of what is made. In this mode, beings are primarily interpreted as representable and represented, meaning they're seen primarily as things accessible to calculation, production, implementation, planning, management. It's a worldview where everything, nature, people, ideas, time itself is potentially quantifiable, useful, and subject to technical control and optimization. Though the text notes its roots go way back, intertwined with Greek techna and even the Christian idea of beings as ens creatum, created things, hence implicitly knowable and manageable by their creator, and by extension, perhaps by us.
And lived experience, or Erlebnis in German, this arises alongside machination, almost as its cultural counterpart, maybe, reinforcing the human-centric focus.
Exactly. Lived experience, Erlebnis, is seen as an offshoot, almost a symptom or a confirmation of machination. It serves to entrench it further. How? By focusing intensely on individual feelings, subjective interpretations, personal narratives on what can be immediately experienced and validated from a purely personal, subjective standpoint. This, the text argues, leads back to an anthropological way of thinking. It places the human being, the individual subject, back at the center, often on a kind of updated Cartesian foundation, the ego cogito, disguised in psychological or personalistic terms. It confirms the human-centric view of reality, ironically reinforcing the very conditions of machination, precisely at a time when being itself is withdrawing its more profound grounding presence. It becomes the age where everything is just a matter of lived experience, which, the text suggests, ends up validating machination unconditionally by making individual subjective feeling the ultimate arbiter of reality.
And the consequences of this era, dominated by machination and lived experience, sound quite dire in the text. It talks about a profound decisionlessness and even the emergence of the technologized animal. What does that mean?
The consequences are painted in stark terms. This era, characterized by machination, leads to decisionlessness, which isn't just about individuals being unable to make up their minds. It's a deeper condition. A fundamental avoidance of making truly essential grounding decisions about our existence, about our historical path. This avoidance allows for the unboundedness of machinations, where, as the text vividly puts it, size spreads to the monstrous proportions of the gigantic. Think massive scale, total calculation, relentless optimization. Everything becomes calculable. Useful. Progress is defined merely as expediting what already is, making things faster, bigger, more efficient, without any genuine re-questioning of the foundations. And the ultimate trajectory, the text warns, is the emergence of the technologized animal.
The technologized animal. That's a chilling phrase. It feels uncomfortably relevant today. Could you paint a clearer picture of what that means for us? Is it like a literal loss of our biological instincts? Or more subtle, maybe spiritual erosion? Where our basic drives are just mediated and managed by technology, making us efficient but empty.
It seems to lean more towards the latter, a deep systemic mediation and management. Imagine a society where almost every choice, every interaction, even our most primal urges, hunger, connection, desire, are increasingly filtered through optimizing algorithms, technological platforms, data-driven suggestions. Our instincts in this scenario aren't eradicated, but they're replaced, or at least heavily overlaid, by technologically facilitated fulfillments and suggestions. We become supremely adaptive to the technological environment, excellent functionaries within a vast, complex technological system. But the text suggests we might simultaneously lose our capacity for truly grounding decisions, for confronting the raw, uncalculable, perhaps uncomfortable aspects of existence, for asking the fundamental questions about why we function at all. We become efficient, maybe comfortable, perhaps constantly entertained, but we might lose our connection to the deeper questions of meaning, purpose, and our place in the unfolding of being. We end up unconsciously avoiding the very plight that calls for essential decisions. It's a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying thought that our progress could lead us to such a state of fundamental avoidance.
It really is. And it prompts another reflective question. Can you identify instances, maybe in your own daily life, or just looking at wider society, where this relentless pursuit of results and usefulness machination, or this intense focus on subjective lived experience, might be obscuring these deeper questions of existence? It feels like this dynamic is all around us once you start looking for it.
Oh, absolutely. It seems pervasive once you tune into it. Think about the relentless focus on metrics, KPIs, key performance indicators in almost every sector. Education, scientific research, healthcare, business, even personal self-improvement apps tracking your every step and mood. The goal so often becomes optimizing for those measurable results, sometimes clearly at the expense of qualitative depth, unquantifiable value, or simply time for reflection. Or consider the constant drive for technological solutions to every problem, where efficiency and utility are the paramount virtues, and the profound impact on, say, our relationship with the natural world, or the quality of human connection, or even our own attention spans, is rarely subjected to truly fundamental questioning. Even in personal interactions or public discourse, the emphasis on individual lived experience, my truth, and my feelings, while important in some contexts, can sometimes inadvertently become a way to shut down deeper engagement with complex realities, or with perspectives that challenge our own subjective viewpoint. It can shield us from confronting uncomfortable or unrepresentable aspects of existence. And the text suggests the greatest danger, the greatest plight, is precisely the lack of a sense of plight amidst all this, where being has become so ordinary, so taken for granted, so covered over by machination and experience, that its withdrawal isn't even noticed. We don't even realize what we've lost. Hashtag Tech 4.2, language, silence, and the call of the gods.
So in this challenging age, characterized by machination, this sense of lostness, this potential technologized animal, where do we turn? Where's the path forward? The text points towards language, interestingly, but not ordinary language. It mentions this dilemma that our everyday language is somehow used up, degraded, maybe even part of the problem.
Yeah.
How can language be used up?
Yes, it's a striking claim. The text argues that ordinary language, having been used up and degraded through idle chatter, through its constant employment in describing, calculating, and facilitating machination, simply cannot express the truth of being. It's become too accustomed to speaking of beings, too tied to categorizing, representing, objectifying. It's lost its original power, its potential to intimate the depths, the mystery, the essential occurrence of existence. And the answer isn't seen as creating some new artificial philosophical language either. That would just be another construct, another form of making, and would likely fail to genuinely speak from or be heard by the core of our being. The text emphasizes that saying and hearing must share the same origin, the same attunement to being.
Okay, so if we can't invent a new language and our current language is used up, how do we transform it? How do we find a way to speak that can approach being? It sounds like we need to resensitize ourselves or our language to its deeper potential.
Precisely. It's about transformation, not invention. The goal is described as to say the most nobly emerged language in its simplicity and essential force, to learn to say the language of beings as the language of being. This requires, the text suggests, a fundamental transformation of both our saying and our hearing, an opening of the truth of being. It's about reattuning our speech, allowing it to resonate with the underlying essential occurrence, rather than just describing surfaces or facilitating transactions. It's about letting language intimate more than it explicitly states. Maybe it's like learning to hear the deeper harmonies and dissonances in a piece of music you thought you knew well, suddenly revealing a whole new layer of meaning and feeling.
This profound transformation of language, this deep listening and careful saying, it feels like it leads us directly to another key concept, bearing silence, or seigetics. What exactly is seigetics? Is it just being quiet, or is it something more active, more deliberate?
Seigetics is presented as much more than just the absence of noise. It's introduced as the prudent lawfulness of the silence-bearing activity. It's even described, provocatively, as the true logic of philosophy in the other beginning. So it's not passive quietness, it's an active, deliberate cultivation of silence, a mode of profound listening, of allowing space. It seeks the truth of being's essential occurrence precisely as an intimating, resonating concealment. It acknowledges that being's truth is a profound mystery that speaks, perhaps most powerfully, through its withholding, through its not being fully present or explicit or conceptually graspable. The text goes so far as to say the laws of bearing silence are higher than those of any logic, recognizing that being cannot be captured or expressed directly through dialectics or concepts alone. It's about allowing what cannot be said explicitly to resonate within us, within the stillness.
This intimating, resonating concealment, it sounds very closely connected to what the text calls the last God. What is the role of the last God here? It's clearly not a traditional religious deity, is it?
No, absolutely not a traditional deity in the metaphysical sense. The last God is described as essentially occurring in intimation, in the intrusion and remaining absent. It's not identical with the event of being, but it's seen as needing the event. Being's essential occurrence is needed for the passing, the withdrawal, and perhaps the eventual arrival of this last God. Its passing, its subtle presence, requires stillness. It requires a reticent unison of those who are prepared, those who have cultivated that basic disposition, that restraint we talked about. So the last God represents a profound, subtle, perhaps divine dimension that reveals itself only through hints, whispers, absences, rather than through explicit revelation or undeniable manifestation. This aligns perfectly with being itself being a self-concealing occurrence. The text even suggests the gods themselves are somehow undecided, because the space for their appearance, the open realm of divinization, is still withheld or obscured in our age. Our role, as Dasein, is to be at the disposal of the gods by inventively thinking the essence of truth, preparing the ground, the clearing for their possible future arrival.
Wow. And the text uses a very evocative metaphor here, describing being as a hearth fire. What does that image convey? How does it help us understand how we might find or attune to being in our current plight?
Yes, it's a powerful image. Being is likened to a hearth fire in the midst of the lodging of the gods. Like a hearth fire, it provides warmth and light, a center. But it also, by its very glow, reveals the estrangement, the shadows, for humans who are lost and immersed only in beings, in the hustle and bustle of the everyday. To truly find or sense being, the metaphor suggests, one must learn to watch over the night. One must resist the allure of the false days of everydayness, which try to eliminate all darkness with artificial, borrowed light. This emphasizes that the truth of being isn't found in the superficial glare of constant activity, endless information, or readily available answers. It's found more in a patient, vigilant receptivity, an openness to its hidden yet fundamental, warming, grounding presence. It means learning to tolerate the darkness, the uncertainty, the quiet, not always chasing artificial illumination or constant stimulation.
So this is really practical, in a way. How can we, listening to this, try to cultivate a deeper mode of hearing and saying, one that's attuned to this intimating, resonating concealment of being, even when we're surrounded by the clamor and data of modern life? It sounds like it demands a real shift in our daily orientation, not just an intellectual agreement with the ideas.
It absolutely demands a conscious, sustained effort. It goes back to cultivating that basic disposition of restraint, diffidence, perhaps even shock or foreboding. This means actively trying to disengage, at least sometimes, from the incessant demand for immediate utility, calculable results, constant communication, even if just for brief periods. It might involve deliberately creating space for practices that embrace silence or reflective thought, a willingness to simply be with profound questions without demanding immediate answers, concretely. Maybe it means dedicating time to deep reading of challenging texts, or engaging in creative practices, writing, art, music that emphasize the unsaid, the ambiguous, the unrepresentable, or perhaps even just carving out moments for quiet contemplation, walking in nature, truly listening amidst the daily noise. It means, essentially, choosing sometimes to watch over the night rather than perpetually trying to flood it with the borrowed light of constant information and stimulation. Allowing space for the subtle intimation of being to potentially resonate. It's about trying to become more like the sower described in the text, perhaps. Taking slow, measured, thoughtful, almost hesitant steps in an isolated field under the vast heaven, rather than joining the frenzied high-speed pursuit characteristic of machination.
Taking time to listen for the silence between the notes.
Beautifully put, yes.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground being. The event, Dasein, machination, language, silence. Now let's turn to how the text redefines history itself. Another radical move. It insists history is not merely a record of past events, what we usually call historiology, nor is it just something humans do. So what is history in this philosophy if it's not dates and deeds and human actions?
Yes, this is another fundamental reorientation that challenges our everyday assumptions about time and human agency. History, in this text, is not simply the chronological account of human actions, nor a linear progression towards some goal, nor is it seen as exclusively a human prerogative. The text states quite unequivocally that history is the essence of being itself. It is the essential occurrence of being as the appropriating event, Ereignis. And crucially, its essence must be determined independently of our usual notions of becoming, development, progress, or the kinds of cause and effect explanations used in traditional historiography. It requires moving beyond the subject-object framework where humans are seen as the primary subjects making history.
Wow, history is the essence of being itself. So where does this essence, this history, actually play out? The text talks about a dynamic, almost sacred space, an in-between.
You've got it. History, in this profound sense, plays out only in the between, specifically the between of the encounter of gods and humans. And this between is also described as the ground of the strife of world and earth. So it's conceived as a site of dynamic tension unfolding, encounter. Not a static timeline or just a sequence of discrete events caused solely by humans. It implies that true history isn't just something humans make through their choices and actions alone, but something that happens, that essentially occurs through the interplay of these fundamental forces, the withdrawal and intimation of gods, the grounding response of humans as Seyn, the clearing for being.
And our role within this unfolding history isn't passive observation then. We're not just spectators watching a cosmic play. The text mentions creative exposure.
That's exactly right. Historical meditation, thinking historically in this deeper sense, is not about spectating or just learning facts about the past. Instead, the text says it awakens and brings about thoughtful questioning as the site of the decisions of history. This means our very engagement with history, our thoughtful questioning now, is itself a creative act, one that participates in shaping history's unfolding. It's a call to profound attentiveness, a willingness to step into this space of decision that determines the direction of being's history. Our active thinking, our being there, as Seyn, actually helps call history into being, helps shape its course.
This seems to lead to a very specific and maybe quite daunting decision that the text emphasizes, a fundamental either-or choice facing us.
Yes, the text highlights what it calls the most originarily and thus most historical decision. And it frames it starkly as an either-or. Either remaining entangled in metaphysics and its increasingly crude modern variants, caught in the plight of the abandonment by being, or initiating the other beginning, the leap into inceptual thinking attuned to being. And crucially, this isn't presented as just a subjective choice, a personal preference for one philosophy over another. It's described as an Entscheidung, a sundering, a fundamental separation or parting of ways happening at the very core of being's historical occurrence. It's a momentous turning point, a historical imperative arising from the plight of abandonment itself that will determine the future of humanity and the possibility of being's truth finding a home.
So thinking about this conception of history, if history is the essential occurrence of being, rather than just a linear progression of human deeds or societal forces, what does this imply for how we understand big societal changes, or even our own personal roles within those changes? It seems to imbue every moment, every decision with a much deeper, maybe even weightier significance.
It radically shifts our usual perspective. Societal changes from this viewpoint are no longer seen merely as the result of human agency, political struggles, or economic forces operating in isolation. They become potential manifestations of being's own history, its withdrawal, its refusal, its subtle intimations, the strife between world and earth playing out, and our personal roles. They transcend just individual ambitions or fulfilling social functions. We become participants, whether consciously or unconsciously, in this larger historical drama of being. This view really challenges the often linear, progressive narratives of history we're used to. It suggests that profound shifts are rooted in this deeper sundering, this turning at the core of being itself. Perhaps this perspective could foster a greater sense of responsibility for our collective historical destiny, not just as agents trying to make change happen, but as potential preservers, grounders, stewards of being's truth in the face of its pervasive abandonment. It means the choices we make now, the way we think and live, are not just about our immediate future, but might echo within the very unfolding of reality for generations to come.
That's a profound responsibility.
It is indeed. Hashtag tag 5.2, time-space as the abyssal ground.
This deep view of history as the essential occurrence of being seems to naturally lead us to a similarly redefined understanding of time and space. The text talks about originary time-space being more originary than our usual ways of thinking about them. What does this originary time-space actually mean if it's not just the separate dimensions of time and space that we're used to measuring and moving through?
Right. In traditional thought, going way back, time and space are often treated as separate entities. Or maybe as fixed dimensions, like the coordinates on a map or the ticking of a clock, the container for events. Or, as in Kant, as subjective forms of intuition, structures we impose on experience. This philosophy, however, proposes time-space, often hyphenated or run together as something far more fundamental, an intimate essential occurrence. It's not just an interconnection of two distinct things, time plus space. It's presented as a primordial belonging together, a gathering embrace that captivates and transports at once. This concept aims to overcome those traditional views, Aristotle's focus on the now, Kant's subjective forms, seeing them as derivative, as perhaps arising from this more fundamental time-space.
Okay, so it's not just the stage on which life plays out, but maybe the very stuff that forms both the stage and the players. Like how in modern physics, gravity isn't just a force acting in space-time, but space-time is gravity, it's curvature. It's something like that interwoven fabric. And that phrase, gathering embrace, sounds incredibly dynamic, not like a static grid at all.
Exactly. It's conceived as the dynamic, interwoven weave of reality itself. And this leads directly to one of the most challenging but also most profound concepts in the text, time-space, as the abyssal ground, abgrund. Now, abyss here doesn't mean a void or sheer nothingness or simply a lack of ground. That's crucial. Instead, it signifies the staying away of the ground, a hesitant self-withholding that paradoxically opens up originary emptiness. This emptiness isn't mere nothingness either. It's a primordial clearing, a preeminent and originary kind of leaving unfulfilled, leaving empty. It's the ground that grounds everything else precisely by withholding itself, by not being a fixed foundation in the usual sense. It reveals its depth through this very absence or withdrawal.
That is a very challenging idea, an abyssal ground that grounds things not by being solid underneath, but by staying away, by withholding itself. Can you give us maybe another way to grasp that? It feels very counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive to our usual thinking. Let's try an analogy, though all analogies will fall short. Imagine the deepest, unseen roots of a massive, ancient tree. They're hidden far beneath the earth, constantly drawing nourishment, anchoring the tree, shaping its growth, allowing it to reach for the sky. You never actually see these roots directly in their grounding function. You only experience the magnificent tree itself, its presence, its stability, that hidden self-withdrawing depth from which all the manifest growth and stability emerge that gets closer to the feeling of the abyssal ground. It's the ground that grounds by holding itself back, creating the open space, the originary emptiness from which everything else can emerge and stand. This abyss isn't chaos, it's the source of all originary openness, all manifestation.
Okay, that helps visualize it a bit, the unseen source enabling the seen. And within this abyssal ground, the text says, truth itself takes on a different character, one marked by strife. So even truth isn't peaceful or settled here.
Yes, exactly. This abyssal ground, this time-space, is the prime essential clearing concealment. It is the essential occurrence of truth itself. However, and this is key, this truth is permeated with negativity in the oscillation and so in strife. This strife isn't just conflict between different beings or ideas like a war or a debate. It's understood as the more fundamental tension, the dynamic interplay between what the text calls earth, the self-secluding, concealing aspect, and world, the self-opening, structuring aspect. It is within this intimate strife, this dynamic back and forth between revealing and concealing, that truth is set into work and preserved. This highlights truth's inherently dynamic, unstable, often difficult nature. It's not a static possession, but an ongoing event. This truth, in its intimate conflictuality, is the very truth of being itself, always encompassing both clearing and concealment, openness and mystery.
So a final reflective question here, maybe the most mind-bending one. How might conceiving of time and space, not as fixed dimensions or containers, but as this dynamic, abyssal ground for all reality, how might that actually change your experience of the world and your place in it? It sounds like it invites a much more fluid, dynamic, maybe unsettling, but perhaps also more profound understanding of existence. It seems to demand a constant questioning of what we think is solid and real.
It would fundamentally challenge our everyday orientation, wouldn't it? If time and space are not stable, pre-given containers that simply hold our lives and the things around us, but are rather this abyssal ground, dynamically unfolding, self-withholding, grounding through absence, it means our reality is far less fixed, far less secure, far less known than we usually assume. Our experience of the world might become less about navigating predefined coordinates on a map and more about dwelling within an open, unfolding essential occurrence, a continuous event. Our place in it would feel less like occupying a specific point in a grid, and more like being swept up in, participating within, this dynamic gathering embrace of time-space. It could evoke perhaps a deeper sense of wonder, maybe awe, but also humility, as we recognize the profound abyssal mystery that underpins even the most mundane, taken-for-granted aspects of our existence. This perspective urges us constantly to question the supposed reality and the provenance of time and space themselves, to move beyond superficial, everyday understandings towards grasping their essential occurrence as the truth of being. It's a dizzying thought, certainly, but maybe ultimately a liberating one, too, freeing us from the illusion of a totally fixed and knowable reality.
Liberating, unsettling, profound. Definitely a lot to think about. Hashtag outro. Wow, what an incredible journey we've been on today. We've really embarked on a deep exploration of contributions to philosophy of the event. We've uncovered its radical re-questioning of existence, the nature of being as this essential event, and that stark contrast drawn between the first beginning of metaphysics and the necessary other beginning of inceptual thinking.
We really have. We've seen how humanity, conceived as Seyn, is called to this profound role being a steward of truth. Navigating an age the text characterizes quite starkly by machination and the abandonment by being, and seeking to find meaning perhaps in the abyssal ground of time-space and through attunement to the subtle intimation of the last God.
Yeah, we've delved into concepts that genuinely challenge our most fundamental assumptions about reality, about ourselves, about time, about truth itself. Moving beyond that familiar territory of beings and truth as simple correctness, to explore a reality that's described as dynamic, often self-concealing, and demanding a completely different kind of engagement from us.
An engagement rooted, as we discussed, in cultivating a profound basic disposition, things like restraint, diffidence, maybe even shock, and a deep attunement to silence, to what isn't immediately said or seen. It really is a call to rethink, maybe refeel, and certainly reorient ourselves to the very fabric of existence.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it really challenges all of us, doesn't it? To move beyond superficial understandings, beyond inherited truths, and to genuinely confront the core of reality as this philosophy presents it. So as we wrap up today, here's something to consider, a final thought provocation for you. If the modern world, as the text argues, is largely a product of machination and maybe a pervasive lack of a sense of plight, what unusual practices, what different modes of thinking or being might be necessary for you personally to genuinely confront being, to actively participate in your own way in this other beginning of history? How might your deliberate engagement with silence, with restraint, or perhaps just with a renewed sense of wonder about the everyday, how might that open up new pathways to truth, pathways that might pull you out of the relentless scuffle and into that profound stillness where being might, just might, intimate itself?
That's a powerful question to leave things on. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We truly hope this conversation has offered a unique perspective, sparked some questions, and maybe even encouraged your own inceptual thinking.
Until next time, keep